He deserves to die!
No! We don't decide who lives and dies. Not down here!
Today, we're going to break down a series of power struggles between Bellamy and Clarke, which ultimately ends with Bellamy accepting Clarke as his equal. Along the way, we're going to cover 3 principles that you need to keep in mind when you are in the middle and coming to the end of a power struggle. If you want to gain a good understanding about what this series is about, head to my introduction video. Spoiler warning going forward. For those of you who don't know what the 100 is, here's the rundown. Humans have survived in space for a century after a nuclear war destroyed Earth. However, oxygen on the space station is running out, so they send a group of teenage criminals, who number roughly 100, back down to Earth to see if it's survivable. There are links in the description below for you to watch the relevant clips of what we're breaking down, if you would like to have a more specific understanding of what's going on. They are called, in order, Second Teenage Public Forum, Clarke vs. Bellamy, Rescuing Jasper, Food for Wristbands, Jasper Dying, and Clarke Kills Adam. Now that we've covered that, let's dive right in. First, a breakdown of Bellamy's actions in the camp. We have Bellamy's subordinate, Adam, overextending here, assuming that he can just take Wells' clothes from him, which prompts a reaction from Wells, and a confrontation is now necessary to get the clothes from him. Bellamy steps in, takes the clothes from Wells, and Bellamy dares him to fight back, which Wells doesn't. Instead, he gives in, gives up the clothes, and loses another small victory. Adam handled that poorly. He tried to confront Wells on his own, and because of that, if a fight were to break out, it'd be completely up to Adam's ability to fight to secure a small victory. Since he hasn't seen Wells fight, he's got a 50-50 shot of losing. And if Wells wins a small victory over him, that's really bad for Adam, because Wells is close to the bottom of the camp hierarchy right now. Bellamy has to step in to avoid this, and he handles it more subtly than just getting involved in a brawl. Then, a potentially really sticky situation comes up. Murphy is trying to torture a girl publicly, while saying it's to further Bellamy's declared vision for the wristbands. This could be bad for Bellamy, because if he lets this stand, his name is now associated with torture. But Bellamy also probably doesn't know how far he's willing to go yet for the wristbands, and it will create disunion if he puts down his main supporter in public. This might explain why he doesn't react either positively or negatively when he sees what's happening. Luckily, he gets out of having to address what's happening when Wells attacks Murphy. What happens next is quite interesting. Wells and Murphy get into a fight, and Wells wins both phases of the fight. Initially, it's a fist fight. The fact that Wells won should be concerning for Bellamy, because Wells has now publicly won a small victory against his main guy. The same scenario that he just avoided with Adam. This time it's worse though, because there's a large crowd to see it, and Murphy is a little bit more important than Adam. So, Bellamy allows a knife fight to go on, which means at this moment he's probably decided that he's willing to let Wells die. However, unfortunately for Bellamy, Wells wins again. This is another and more impressive small victory. It proves to the crowd that maybe Wells isn't as defeated as they originally thought, which is really bad for Bellamy. But this also looks really bad for Murphy, since he's proved he both has a lack of public tact and doesn't have the skills to take out Bellamy's enemies. Watch this space, it will become important later. This ties into the first general principle, which is, your subordinates' victories and defeats are your victories and defeats. You need to think of the people who work for you or have been seen to be on your side as extensions of yourself. When they speak or do something, it's the same as you speaking or doing something. This is because outside people and groups see you and your group as if you're united, or a single entity. So when people see Murphy torturing someone, if Bellamy says nothing about it, that's the same thing as Bellamy torturing somebody. If Adam loses a fight against Wells, that's the same as if Bellamy loses a fight against Wells. So, with all that in mind, the people who Bellamy have currently surrounded himself with are not helping his cause. This is at the exact moment that Clarke and her group return from the woods. Fast forward. Clarke has lost her second public debate against Bellamy. She's again trying to be demanding without having worked for her success. As such, she convinces them for a second based purely on the strength of her argument. But it's then easily beaten by Bellamy, who uses a strong emotional hook to get them back on his side. Now that she's lost 3 times, twice in public forum, she has no truck with the greater group at large, and her influence is at a very low point, even if she's got support from specific individuals. If she's going to survive as an influential figure in the group at large, she needs to change strategies and do something drastic. Now, Clarke's goal has shifted to rescuing Jasper, but the problem is almost no one is willing to go with her, because it's dangerous and she hasn't tried to convince anyone about why it's in their interests to go. She's also lost Finn, who again is someone who carries a lot of influence with him, and she's told several of her supporters that they can't come for various reasons. She's also in a very exposed position, since she just lost her second public debate, meaning her ability to convince people is quite limited, without influential people by her side like Finn. So with all these issues, what does she do? She goes directly to Bellamy. Bellamy happens to be surrounded by his goons at this time, so she's not only going to confront her main rival directly, but she's going to do so while surrounded by his allies, which is something we've heard not to do. But it'll end up working out for her. She starts by asking if he has a gun, which he reveals. She then commands him to follow her, which prompts him to ask why he would do that. She then issues a public challenge. If you don't come, you're scared. Bellamy then decides to come, and he brings Murphy with him. As they're going, Bellamy spins it to Murphy as they're going to steal the wristband, which is to distract from the fact that Clarke won a small victory over him. This is very well executed on Clarke's part. She kept in control of the conversation the whole time by asking a question, then commanding, which forces Bellamy into the responding position twice, and then issuing a public challenge that Bellamy then ignores at his peril. The fact that she was surrounded and outnumbered ultimately meant nothing, because she successfully manipulated the main man directly. And considering how low her influence was, as well as how strong Bellamy's position was, this was quite brave of her to do. However, Bellamy brings Murphy with him, which means he's still bringing some manpower with him to be his ally while he's alone with Clarke in the woods. This could be bad. Bellamy here is doing a couple of things. He starts a conversation, bringing up a point, which he can then use to segue to what he actually wants, which is to take the wristband. Why is this important? Because it puts your opponent at ease, and it creates a smooth feeling and quality to your proposal. The conversation lasts only a couple of seconds before he brings up his topic, but because he asked a question first, it feels smoother, and thus harder to resist. Next, he picks his moment deliberately. They've walked a little ways from the camp where Clarke can't get any help, then with Murphy, picks a fight with Clarke, telling her that they'll keep going if she takes off the wristband. He's trying to use his usefulness as a leverage. Clarke is hostile to him and refuses, and it looks like a fight is going to break out. This is okay for Bellamy, because he brought Murphy along with him for this specific purpose. Except, Finn suddenly shows up. His presence makes it 3-on-2, meaning Bellamy and Murphy are now outnumbered. This puts Bellamy back on his heels. Then Finn takes control and separates Bellamy and Clarke, meaning Clarke has now won another small victory, because they keep going and she doesn't have to take her wristband off. This ties into the second principle, which is, power is in physical presence and body count. We saw this earlier with Wells, Bellamy, and Adam, and it works for the same reason here with Clarke. Think of it like a battle. If you decide to engage with someone, the more people they have on their side, the more you're outnumbered, and vice versa. So the more people that are with you against your opponent, the more likely you are to win. But it's not just theoretical, who in all the camp is on my side. It's, how many people physically standing in this room support me as opposed to the other guy? Overwhelming body count makes it way easier to win your engagements, and thus win small victories. This is why Finn's arrival is really helpful, and why he's able to take control of the situation as quickly as he did. If you're trying to get your way, remember, power is in physical presence and body count. Clarke and her team return with Jasper in tow. This is a very obvious small victory in the crowd's eyes, because Clarke has finally accomplished a goal she set, and she did it without anybody else volunteering. However, it's immediately undercut by the fact that Bellamy and Murphy bring out food. The crowd is cheering, and Bellamy is now officially posing as the provider for food for the group, as well as being their inspirational leader. This has just created a second very strong pillar that makes it difficult for anyone to oppose him as leader. Then, he starts using the food as leverage to get people to take off their wristbands. Finn manages to think of a way around the rules, and uses Bellamy's logic against Murphy and takes some food for him and Clarke. Somebody decides to follow their example, but Bellamy punches him, then storms off. There are a couple of things that are happening here. One, Finn, but really Clarke, have scored a small victory, as they very publicly subvert Bellamy's demand that they trade in wristbands for meat. 2, the guy who steps out of line to follow their example is quite brave, but ultimately foolish, because he does it by himself and with no plan. Finn got away with that because he went in expecting a confrontation and had an answer to stun Murphy so that he could leave unharmed. This guy saw that and decided he could just try and take meat. 3, Bellamy hits him to enforce his rules. He had been relying on people being in awe of him to go along with his demand. He's also positioning this as, yes, you have to make a trade, but it's liberating being on the other side, and this is good for you, as we can see by him personally congratulating everyone who makes the trade. He's also got several people all around him delivering out the food, so that by sheer body count, he could fight whoever he had to so he could enforce the trade-off. But that power is implied, and it should stay implied, because people don't feel fear and excitement at the same time. Finn has just managed to expose that people don't actually have to do that if they can be sneaky, so he resorts to violence to scare people into complying. Suddenly, the violence and power is now direct instead of implied, which shatters everyone's positive image of him, which is exactly what he wanted to avoid. It's also him reacting because he's frustrated that Clarke scored a victory. This leads to 4. He's again seeing that Murphy is unable to handle Bellamy's enemies and is putting Bellamy in awkward positions. That's bad for Murphy, and you can see in how Bellamy looks at him that he's annoyed. A break is starting to occur in Bellamy's group. In this one, Bellamy is breaking the don't go into your enemy's turf alone rule, and we see that he fails and suffers a couple of small defeats here because of that. He's also displaying a surprising lack of strategic sense, given how well he's done before. Because remember, at this point, Clarke is still far below him in terms of group influence. She's also currently the bad guy, because she's caring for someone who's driving everyone crazy. He's got time on his side, and there's an opportunity here for him to start moving in a direction to put Clarke and her faction down. But he doesn't. He gets a bit sloppy, and he gets a bit direct. He's gone in by himself. He tries to force Clarke to accept his point of view with no real reason why she should listen to him, threatens to kill Jasper tomorrow if something isn't done, and tries to force Octavia to follow him, which she refuses to do. He's suffered 2 small defeats, and has just put out an ultimatum that's not good for him to enforce, but to not enforce it means his words are seen as weak. He tried to be demanding with no tact, which is the main reason Clarke has lost repeatedly to Bellamy for the group. That was a bad performance by Bellamy. This is the moment that Bellamy decides to accept Clarke as his equal. He'd been losing a surprising and steady amount of small victories at her hand, but without this moment, it amounts to nothing substantial. Bellamy is being forced to do something he's never had to confront: mercy kill someone. He takes charge with some help from Charlotte, sends everyone away, and makes it seem like he's going to do it. But he hesitates. Despite the fact that Adam is begging him to do it, he's paralyzed, both with indecision and fear. It's at this moment that Clarke arrives. She comes over and talks with Bellamy. Right now, they're not enemies. They're 2 people standing over the ruined body of someone they both knew. And then Clarke decides she'll take charge, takes the knife, and kills Adam while humming to him. This is completely transformative. For the first time, Bellamy sees Clarke as someone who can actually help him. In his moments of paralysis, she came, took charge, and helped him with an awful burden. She also handled this very well. She didn't fight with Bellamy, she didn't make him feel bad, they didn't talk about anything else. She saw he was struggling, that someone needed her help, and so she gently nudged Bellamy into letting her do it for him. The way we know that this transformed Bellamy's viewpoint of Clarke is because, when he gets back to the camp, He tells one of his people to make sure Clarke has everything she needs to treat the wounded. By this point, Clarke has managed to come back in terms of influence. She pivoted, started acting strategically, won 5 to 6 small victories against Bellamy consecutively, and then dramatically changed his perception of her when she managed to spare him from having to kill Adam. The small victories were important, because without that, even if Clarke had helped him, he wouldn't have been able to see her as an equal. But without the change of heart at the end, the victories wouldn't have amounted to anything substantial in the long run. They played into each other. Clarke, in the matter of what appears to be a couple of days, changed her trajectory completely. Because if Bellamy respects her, the camp will come to respect her too. This ties into the third and final principle of the video, which is, if you're alive, patient, and clever, you can always make a comeback. Power is a tricky thing. It ebbs and it flows. Sometimes you're on top, and sometimes you're not. But just because you get defeated, or even if you get really defeated, that doesn't have to be the end of your influence, or of you. As we saw with Wells, all he had to do was win some small victories, and suddenly he's no longer as defeated as he was a day before. Similarly with Clarke. Some might have said her cause to become leader in the wider group was lost, and yet, within a couple of days, she ends her struggles with Bellamy as his equal. If you're alive, you patiently wait for the right moment, and you act cleverly, you can always make a comeback. Well, there you have it. While Clarke's position is a little shaky, she and Bellamy have essentially ended their journeys to become the leaders of the 100. Now, let's sum up the 3 principles. We have 1, your subordinates' victories and defeats are your victories and defeats. 2, power is in physical presence and body count. And 3, if you're alive, patient, and clever, you can always make a comeback. In the next episode, we see them deal with their first major group-wide crisis. I'm going to call it the Murphy Crisis. You'll have to check next episode to see why that is. Have you ever made peace with someone you hated? What did you have to do to make that happen? How did it feel once you did? If any of these questions hit home for you, comment what your answer is down in the comments below. I hope you'll join me for the next episode. Like and subscribe, and remember, we're going through this so that you can learn how to become the leader you were always born to be. I hope you have a fantastic day.
Brave princess.